Thank you all so much for sticking around. I know we're in the final presentations of the second or third day, depending if you attended the workshops. So I'm excited to be here. My name is Sophia Costa. I am a PhD candidate from Florida International University, and I will be presenting on some of my dissertation work today. So of course, as we all know in this room, there are many challenges to fisheries and recreational fisheries in general. Of course, the biggest one is data limitations. So it's estimated that about 80% of the global catch is considered data limited, and that's due to a number of reasons. First, data collection methods, things like lack of technology, things like infrastructure, poor infrastructure being found on a global scale, insufficient training, limited funding, and things like policy and governance, so lack of enforcement. So what I want to highlight, though, is that although we have data-limited fisheries, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are data absent. And one of the biggest connecting sources, or things that's lacked within recreational fisheries and fisheries in general, is the stakeholder wisdom. It's really an untapped resource. So for instance, in one of our surveys that we conducted, one of our anonymous fishing guides, for instance, gave this quote, that in a 10-year period, we watched 50 acres of seagrass vanish. It has turned into mud. The fish are gone, as are most of the birds. So some very rich data. I also have this great video that's from a podcast, like someone mentioned earlier, who is discussing some of the local ecological knowledge of some of our long-term guides and anglers found within our ecosystem. Unfortunately, we don't have sound, so I will do my best to narrate this. So here is Captain Eddie. He is basically saying that during the low tides, when he would show up in the past on the flats, there would be thousands of tarpon rolling. So right there, we're getting indication that we're getting even population sizes from there. He says from there, we had seagrass die-offs, and then these algal blooms really started showing up later in the 80s. So when he was a child, they didn't have these algal blooms. However, around 84, 85, these algal blooms started showing up, which have had a huge impact on the fishery overall. So again, just in this 30-second clip, we're not only getting population trend data, we're also getting habitat trend data, as well as some of the other things that are impacting the fishery overall. So of course, as we all know, this information is widely known as local ecological knowledge, or also a quick definition, knowledge, practices, and beliefs pertaining to the relationship of people with their environment. So this information, this LEK information, not only can be useful in filling those data gaps, but it also can indicate early warning signs within our habitats, just as the video that we just saw. In addition to that, it also offers this partnership and conservation efforts by providing potential assistance with monitoring and support for management regulations overall. In particular, in my study system, we work very closely with fishing guides. So of course, there are a number of reasons that we utilize the information from guides. First, they are trusted experts and educators, so filling in these critical knowledge gaps that might exist within our study system. They're trusted facilitators, as we all know, technical instructors. I know I wouldn't have hooked my first bonefish on a fly if it wasn't for my great guide I was with in Belize, as I'm sure we all have stories of. But then most importantly, their behavior and compliance. So again, highlighting that the direct impact of the effectiveness of management really would fail if it wasn't for the support of our local resource users. So that brings us to my study system, which is located at the southernmost portion of Florida, so right at the end of the peninsula. I focus in Everglades National Park, and more specifically in Florida Bay, which is the beautiful bay in the background of this image. So the Everglades fishery, overall, it's estimated to be generate about $1 billion annually just from recreational fisheries alone. However, in 2019, the mandatory catch reporting system was removed from our fishing guides. And then in 2025, unfortunately, they also removed the creel program due to limitations of resources and funding. So of course, with the removal of this, there is a large lack of fisheries-dependent data. And so the park is, of course, considering bringing this reporting system back. But with that, we wanted to understand who are our anglers, who are our guides found within the system, and what would they like to see if it is brought back. Just a quick overview. I'm going to be using a couple of maybe terms that aren't global terms, so just to let y'all know what I would be discussing. So when I discuss a skiff boat, of course, this is a very shallow, flat-bottom boat. These can get up onto those seagrass and mud flats quite easily. This typically, you'll only see about 2 or 3 individuals on these boats. In comparison, when I'm discussing bay boats, I'm talking about these larger boats, sometimes housing full families when you see them back in the bay. Quickly also for some of our study species, so these are our top targeted species within Everglades National Park: common snook, Atlantic tarpon, red drum, spotted sea trout, mangrove snapper, and triple tail. And I just want to highlight that the mangrove and triple tail in particular are consumptive fish. There is a regulated harvest for snook and red drum as well. But yes, just keep that in mind later in the presentation. So this brings us to our overall study question, which is what are the practices and preferences of our Everglades guides? There were 3 primary goals to identify in this study. The first was to understand the fishery and the guiding characteristics. Second was current catch and release practices as well as preferences for the future within the park. And then third, what are the actual concerns of these Everglades fishing guides? So to do this, we co-produced this survey. We convened a working group of not only researchers from 3 institutions, but also we actually had local fishing guides participate in this working group as well. With that, we did a round of pre-testing or a couple of rounds of pre-testing to ensure the question clarity as well as survey optimization. And so overall, in the end, we ended up sending our survey to 321 Everglades fishing guides, and we got a decent response rate. So although it might sound small compared to some of our other surveyors in the room, for us, this was great. So we had 160 voluntary and anonymous responses. Just to give you all an idea, that's about 50% of our active permit holders for guides within the area. And then when we looked at their use rate of the park, it's about 59% of what we consider active. So these are guides that were going into the park more than 10 days a year. So very quickly, I'll go over some of the things that we identified in the fishery. The first one is that most guides entered the fishery between 2000s to 2010s. So pre-COVID, especially, we had a spike right around 2018, 2019. The average number of years of our Everglades fishing guides was about 18 years. The average number of days that our guides are going out was about 165 days per year. Most guides are spending about 50 to 75% of their total effort within the park. And then 63% of our guides are using both fly and conventional tackle. And then finally, about 68% of our guides are exclusively using skiff boats. So just a reminder, those skiff boats are those shallow, flat-bottom boats. So the next thing that we wanted to look at were catch and release practices and preferences. So we found that 89% of all of our respondents were practicing catch and release in some way. So that was broken down a little bit further into 48% were practicing catch and release for all fish species that they were targeting, versus the additional 41% that were doing catch and release only for some fish species in the park. We had a number of guides write in support of catch and release. So I wanted to highlight this quote from one of our survey respondents that said, "I would rather just practice catch and release as a rule. It would make my job a lot easier if the national park just made it fully catch and release." So pretty surprising findings from this survey. We wanted to go one step further. So we ran conditional inference trees, which is a partitioning method, very similar to a random forest model for those ecological modelers in the room. That basically what it does is it looks at the data and finds those significant splits to understand the drivers for the response to that question. So for this question, again, the general question was, are you currently practicing catch and release? The possible responses were yes for all, yes for some, no, or they could have skipped the question. So what we found were 2 primary splits. The first split being on the amount of time that or the percentage that they're actually doing conventional tackle. So those guides that are doing conventional tackle less than 75% of the time and do not target snapper species were more likely to support catch and release for all, or more likely to practice catch and release for all species. Again, snapper species is a consumptive fish species, just as a reminder. On the other side, we found that guides that are utilizing conventional tackle more than 75% of the time were more likely to only be doing catch and release for some of the fish species that they're targeting. We also asked about future preferences for catch and release in the park. So again, they had the three categories that they could have responded to again. Yes for all, yes for some, no, or NA. What we found is that the guides that are currently practicing catch and release for some species were more likely to support catch and release in the park only for some species. However, on the flip side, those guides that selected catch and release currently on one end of the spectrum or the other, so either all species or no, were further divided over their concern for seagrass and then further broken down into their bay boat use. So we found that guides that are concerned for seagrass and are not using bay boats, so again, these skiff guides, are more likely to support future catch and release efforts in the park for all fish species. The final question in this section that we asked, what individual species would you like to see as future catch and release? So for this, we were only asking the fish species that have a harvest season currently. About 47% of respondents selected snook should be catch and release only within the park, followed by redfish at 40% of our respondents. I just want to highlight very quickly, the stock assessment for snook found that about 90% of the anglers that are harvesting or that are fishing for snook currently in all throughout Florida are releasing them on a voluntary basis anyway. The third aspect that we were looking at were the concerns within the park. So again, asking these guides, what are your overall concerns? We found that seagrass loss was the highest concern for all of our respondents, with 77% of the total respondents selecting seagrass loss. That was followed by lack of freshwater flow or hypersalinity, as well as algal blooms. So I just want to highlight that each of the top three concerns are all habitat concerns, all primarily related to water quality issues within the park. The next two, so the fourth and fifth highest concerns were over the quality of the fishery, as well as shark issues, things like depredation. So again, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper and use conditional inference trees to see who are these populations that are selecting each of these responses. We found that guides that are not using bay boats were primarily concerned with seagrass loss, again, our skiff boat users. Our guides that are currently practicing catch and release for all fish species are most concerned for hypersalinity as well as freshwater flow. Our skiff boat users, as well as our more experienced guides. So guides that have been utilizing the park or fishing in the park for more than 13 years were more concerned with algal blooms. The next one we looked at was our fishing quality. So years guiding in the park was the primary driver, with those guides that have been guiding in the park over 10 years being more concerned with the quality of the fishery. The next one was looking at sediment plumes. So again, the experience really highlighted here with our guides that have been there that have been guiding in the park for more than 15 years and using skiff boats, being more concerned with sediment plumes. And then finally, the shark depredation issue, which we just saw a great presentation by Sally. This is a large issue, especially on the eastern coast of the United States and especially in southern Florida. So we found that our guides that are spending less than 60% of their time in the northwestern portion of the park and are targeting triple tail are the ones that are most concerned with our shark depredation issues. Again, triple tail is a consumptive fish species. So what are the key takeaways? So the first is, of course, we're not really utilizing local ecological knowledge very well and efficiently in our management, especially in the US. As we have seen, not only in this survey, but also in the video beforehand, these guides hold extensive amounts of knowledge that's really not utilized in an efficient manner. The next one is that catch and release is already embedded into the fishery culture, so this could be a great management tool that can be used in the future. I also just want to highlight that Florida is moving towards a regional fisheries management system, and so especially when looking at Everglades National Park, this could be a great management tool for the park officials to use. The next one was looking at concerns. So similar to what Sam just said, most of our respondents were also very concerned with habitat degradation overall. So harvest or fishery quality issues were not the top three concerns. So something for management to focus on and look for in the future. And then the biggest takeaway of this is that in these data-limited recreational fisheries, monitoring really improves when we shift from that compliance-based reporting to a co-produced, knowledge-driven system that are founded really on the resource users' experience, expertise, and long-term ecological observations. Just to give you all an idea of some of the resource users we're talking about, this is an interview that my advisor Jennifer Rehage and I were doing, where we were interviewing Dr. Gordy Hill, who has 95 years of experience within this system. So again, extensive local ecological knowledge that we definitely need to retain while we still can. And with that, I can take any questions if there's time.
Thank you very much. Quick, with the very high release rates for snook and some harvest, in the conversation around people being maybe in favor of complete catch and release, is there any discussion about selective harvest and keeping it from being 100% so that there can be harvest of fish that are injured and unlikely to survive to reduce post-release mortality and things like that?
So just to make sure I got your question correct, instead of going full non-harvest and catch and release, only keeping the ones that are potentially injured?
Yeah, or discussing not going full catch and release so that they still have that option for species where their harvest rates aren't 100%.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as statewide, I am not totally positive on what the responses are as far as moving towards a full catch and release. Since we only really looked or discussed this potential with our guides from the Everglades National Park, we know that they are fully supportive, or majority are supportive of potentially closing the harvest. However, more surveys would need to be done to look at a statewide. As of now, the way that the management of the national park, the fisheries are fully managed by the state. So right now, Everglades National Park does not set their regulatory rules. It is managed fully within FWC, or Florida Fish and Wildlife. However, as we move towards this regional management, that could be an option that maybe in selective areas like the park, we could have that region as fully catch and release. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. We're going to have to move on.